Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Series. In this second volume focused on development plans, we're talking about a topic that's as vital as it is complex: identifying needs and priorities. Development planning is more than filling out forms or setting arbitrary goals. It's about intentional alignment between people and purpose, strategy and execution, and individual potential and organizational direction. In growing businesses, particularly those under 400 employees, and more likely the sweet spot 50 to about 200, the difference between reactive planning and intentional development often shows up in engagement, performance, and long-term viability. Now, this conversation will look a little different for every organization. Needs and priorities vary. What we'll explore today are universal principles and practical tools that you can use to shape growth at both the leadership level and the front lines. Now, let's begin with the simple truth. Not all gaps are created equal. Some gaps are deficit-based, problems that need fixing, misalignments that are hurting performance, or weaknesses that are creating drag. But others are aspirational, the kind of gaps that exist between where you are and where you want to be. And these are the opportunities for growth, innovation, or transformation. Both deficit and aspirational gaps represent a challenge to solve, and that's where the problem-solving mindset becomes critical. It also applies to development plans because development plans are there to close gaps. A problem-solving model that I'm going to give you right now should be familiar, but I've added a sixth step. You may have seen it with six, but typically it's a five-step problem-solving model, and it's pretty universal. I think as an organization, you'll want to make sure the language lines up with how you want to say things, but you want to have best practices around using it so that all teams have a common language and that you know people are approaching it the same way and you're not having avoidable mistakes. So the first step is to clearly define the problem. Make it specific and measurable and meaningful. Einstein said if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes talking about it and only 5 minutes talking about the solution. In other words, he would spend the time on the problem definition. The second step is identify root causes. Go deeper than symptoms. Tools like the 5 whys or fishbone diagrams, quality tools, these will help here. The third step is generate options, create space for open thinking before evaluating, brainstorming, and it can take on different forms. But the point is you want to make sure you get everything out on the table. And sometimes you might have a different group in these meetings than you do in the next meeting, step 4, which is evaluate and select. Use clear criteria aligned with your strategy. You may have different people in these meetings. There may be overlap. But the point is, it's art and science together. You want to look at both of those. And then the fifth step is implement and monitor. Assign ownership and accountability, including a plan for metrics. You want to decide what the metrics are going to be before you get started on the solution. We don't want the goalposts moving. And this is not about just solving today's problem. It's about creating a culture that follows a solid methodology and can repeat that methodology. And it's plug and play. Any team can step in at any point because they understand it. These are things that are important, but often we don't take time to do. It's like draining the swamp versus fighting the alligators. No one's really asking you about draining the swamp, but there's plenty of people asking you for, to meet deadlines and pay bills and these things that get to the fighting alligators. The sixth step, the one I said I like to add, is reflect and adjust. Because in business, nothing ever works exactly as planned. We need to keep learning. I like to say no plan survives contact with reality. So we have to have a way of learning from what took place and getting better for the next time. So this model should be second nature to every leader, as I alluded to, and with common intentional language for your organization, ideally to every team, because there will always be another goal, another crisis, another missed opportunity. A shared approach to problem solving builds confidence and competency and allows for autonomy and capability across your organization. Next, I want to layer in an important distinction: business model versus operating model. So your business model answers the big picture questions. What value do we deliver? To whom? And how do we generate revenue and stay competitive? Your operating model, on the other hand, defines how you organize your resources, roles, and workflows to make the business model come to life day in and day out. One may evolve over a decade, the other might change quarterly. Both models matter. When you're designing development plans, you have to consider these two, the operating model and the business model. But neither of them exist in a vacuum. To really ground development efforts, we have to start with your vision and mission. Your vision is your long-term aspiration, the future state that your business exists to create. Your mission is your purpose, or like the purpose, the reason that your company exists and how it's going to get there. These must be clearly articulated and widely shared across your company. Without that clarity, even your best development plans may drift off course. I want to emphasize the importance of this because when a company gets to the point where they are told that they have to have a board for governance reasons, maybe it's investors, maybe there's partners that they brought on or what have you, but when that board is in place, they are going to push for the vision and the mission statements. They want those articulated and they want them real. It's not just a paperwork exercise, because that's what the board is governing, using for governance, using for their leadership support, etc. So just because nobody's asking you for it doesn't mean it's not important. As the owner, you are sometimes going to have to wear that board hat. Vision and the mission, they must be clearly articulated and widely shared across the company. Without that clarity, even your best development plans may drift off course. Vision and mission create the why behind the how. From there, strategy and tactics guide execution. Strategy defines your high-level approach. Tactics are the ground game. The cascade from vision to tactics creates the foundation for your business and operating models. And those in turn inform how you identify individual and team development priorities. Seen from this perspective, I'm creating context to devote resources, at least time, to thinking about crafting development plans. There are always alligators to worry about. They'll always be there to fight with. Spending some time on draining the swamp will make it easier to win those battles in the future. One of the most powerful metaphors I use is the team metaphor. And I'm talking about describing the workplace. Unlike family or command and control models, a team-based approach helps clarify how performance is evaluated, why some people are promoted and others aren't, what it means to contribute meaningfully, why development is a non-negotiable, not optional. If you don't have this framed out, leaders will often start winging it. When asked why somebody got promoted and they did not, you'll often find that they're just shooting from the hip. And that becomes a problem. And a lot of times when managers are under pressure, they resort to what they learned from their past role, their conditioning kicks in, maybe what was rewarded before, maybe what's worked before. So this kind of an approach, it helps prevent managers, like I said, from winging it when answering why something is done. Winging it will often come from their conditioning, but it's not what we need today in the organization moving forward. A team metaphor sets the table for a playbook and development plans to execute those plays flawlessly. In business, we don't face external defenders like in sports. Our resistance comes from internal inefficiencies, unaligned incentives, protective reflexes, and cultural inertia. That's the real opponent. And we have far more control over it than we may want to admit. Of course, when we admit it, then we have to do something about it. So I get it. This makes flawless execution much easier than, say, on a football team facing a worthy opponent, because there's no one facing us with intensity and direct focus to stop our plays. We do have the internal resistance we have to overcome. We do have to have the inertia that has to be overcome. We do have to have overcome the normal resistance in the marketplace. But we don't have that defender who's literally trying to disrupt the plays. They don't even know our plays. Finally, everything we'll talk about today aligns with principles from self-determination theory. Building environments where people thrive because they feel a sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. You'll see that come through in today's 3 focus areas. Onboarding as a foundation for development, not a checklist. when we think about onboarding, oftentimes people think about two themes. One that is required either because your legal department is telling you to, or because there are regulations that require it. The other theme that may come up is just navigating where the supplies are kept. How do you navigate? What time do you come in? How's lunch handle? All these things, breaks, and where the widgets are. So those two themes come up, and they're usually covered because they have to be. There's immediate pain if they're not. But if you consider a sports team, the regulatory part of it, that's like knowing the rules of the game. So that part is known. They may review them periodically, but they're not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'm not suggesting we don't do that in work, but I'm making the point there's three pillars of this onboarding. It's not just the two. And then, of course, the other one is navigating and finding their way around where the facilities are, the training room, and those kinds of things. Having the three pillars, the sports team, they're going to focus on is running the plays, seamlessly working together, making sure that everybody understands their role in a given play. Drilling, because we want it at the nervous system memory level, like muscle memory, but I call it nervous system memory because that's really what it is. The muscle doesn't have the memory. It may have the strength, but the nervous system firing, through the use of myelin, getting more and more active. The second thing is the feedback that builds intrinsic motivation, not just performance compliance. Intrinsic motivation is a big part of this. Otherwise, you're relying on incentives and external motivation. And then self-regulation and higher order thinking by leaders when crafting and implementing development plans. So we'll talk about those three: onboarding, feedback, and then the leaders' self-regulation so that they can operate in higher order thinking. So we'll also look at 4 domains that benefit from standardization, because assuming that people will just figure it out often leads to misalignment, stagnation, or conflict. And a lot of times the leader will have to wear all of these hats, but it's the different roles that the leader has. And then when you start adding your leadership team in place, you already have played out with that hat. Development plans shouldn't just live in HR documents. They should live in conversations, practices, and shared commitments across the company. By tying them to your business model, operating model, and mission-driven direction, you create an environment where growth is not just possible, it becomes inevitable. It becomes expected. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the onboarding. I already mentioned how there's 2 pillars that come up quite often. That's the regulatory, or the regulations and rules, and then what the legal department tells us, or that our attorneys tell us, just to keep us out of trouble. And along with that might go some accounting, whatever. The point is that neither of those are talking about how to be at your best, how to perform at your best, how to be a player on this team. In talking about onboarding, I'm recommending a business meeting that happens. But this business meeting is not about business, it's about them. This meeting will happen early on. You should not be talking about work in this meeting. I'm not saying you don't have other meetings to talk about work. You may have some urgent things that have to be taken care of. But this meeting is about the employee, and you want to set it up that way, and you want to make sure that you're fully present. If you have to do the meeting early in the morning so that you're fully present and there's no distractions, whatever it takes, you do not want to introduce business into this meeting. And there's a very good reason why. It is about business, but it's about them. This is a chance for the captain to stop steering the boat long enough to listen about where the crew wants to go, and then you can take that into consideration. So in this meeting, there's some things that are going to come out of it. One is you're going to create some psychological safety. That psychological safety is important. I talk a lot about people getting triggered and how we have to create some space so the stimulus response cycle doesn't send us automatically into fight or flight. The subconscious is biased towards looking for threats. The unfamiliar is seen as a threat. What we want to do is create some psychological safety so they have some references that just because they made a mistake, it doesn't mean that there's going to be a problem. I know of employees who thought one mistake that they were going to get fired. I know of employees who forged signatures because they were so worried about getting in trouble, and then they lose their job for forging the signature. People get into fight or flight and they use bad judgment. So having that psychological safety is like a buffer so that you can keep people from falling into that trap. You're going to, as a leader, you're going to model vulnerability. Now, this is not as deep as it sounds. What we're talking about here, we want to avoid folks falling into the child parent, and we don't want to fall into the parent child. It's very, very easy in the workplace for a leader to fall into that parent child mode. It's very easy for the employee to fall into the child parent, and neither one of those are going to be healthy. In the parent mode, right? All the answers, I have all the answers, and I get to judge, and it's my way or the highway. And in the child mode, I'm one step away from being criticized. I'm walking around on eggshells. I hope I'm right. I better find out what they want before I make a decision. I don't have freedom of action. So we don't want to do that. And so one of the ways we're going to model that vulnerability, this meeting, because we're not talking about business, we're talking about them. You won't know everything, and you can say, I don't know. Tell me more about that. I'd like to learn more about that. It's modeling this idea that, hey, I'm not perfect. I don't have all the answers. I'm not the parent. We are in a business relationship. Of course, it aligns with self-determination theory. Self-determination theory and the three pillars, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, is actually the underpinning for all of dynamic leadership, because intrinsic motivation far outperforms, or in terms of results, far outperforms extrinsic motivation. And extrinsic motivation requires a lot of hands-on. Not only does the intrinsic motivation provide more motivation, but in terms of a development plan, it's very natural. It's a very natural fit for them to continue scaling up. From the multipliers, we want to be multipliers. We want to establish being a multiplier, not a diminisher. In the context of this onboarding meeting, you want to explore their strengths. People need to be seen. And so you're going to be exploring their strengths. You're going to uncover their special potential, if you will, their superpower, because those can then come into play when you need somebody. Like I always say, there's another crisis coming. We don't know when, we don't know how big, in what context, but there's always going to be another crisis. You know, if you look at the idea of 100-year anything, whether it's a flood or fire or whatever, these 100-year things exist. They're called 100-year because the likelihood of them happening is 1%. So theoretically, over 100 in a given year. So theoretically, over 100 years, you would see this thing happen one time. But there could be hundreds of 100-year events, meaning we could have in any given year, we could have 1, 2, 3, 4, or none 100-year events occur. So just something to think about. Then we have growth mindset. And the growth mindset it's not just having a growth mindset. People get lost in this. They think, oh, I have a growth mindset because I'm into personal development. And they don't realize that most of their vernacular has to do with a fixed mindset. Not only can a person have a growth mindset in one area and a fixed mindset in another, they can be triggered into a fixed mindset in an instant just because of something happened. They get triggered. Once a person goes into that fight or flight, once there's cortisol flowing and adrenaline flowing, the likelihood of them falling into a fixed mindset is pretty high. And then once they're in a fixed mindset, it's difficult for them to be able to interact. So you as a leader, want to understand when you're falling into a growth mindset. And that's going to come in when we talk about self-regulation. But also, we want to use language that helps the employee stay in a growth mindset. And you're learning how the employee communicates. One of the things I like about this particular onboarding meeting is that you get a chance to calibrate how they are in a non-threatening environment. And then you can use that calibration to notice when they are becoming threatened. Because a person who's threatened, if you don't catch it early enough, like I said, the cortisol starts happening and now it becomes a neurobiological event. And it's not something you can just, whisk away with words. It takes time. But if you can stop it from happening, you can do that with words. So calibrating when do they slip into a fixed mindset? What do they have a fixed mindset about? What do they sound like when they're in growth mindset mode? 20-mile march is from Great by Choice. And it talks about on the good days, you stick to the plan. You don't work extra hard on the good days. And then on the bad days, you work less. In the 20-mile march, the idea was they had to do 20 miles every single day as a South Pole expedition. 20 miles every single day, no matter what. Blizzards, And well, then when weather was good, you still did the 20 miles. And that's the attitude that you have. And they compared it to another team that did the other. They overdid it on the good days, and then they kind of stayed in on the bad days, the blizzards, etc. And they outperformed them. I mean, they beat their time by, if I recall, more than 30 or 40%.